It all starts with a moment of arrogance when two officers think they can intimidate and humiliate a black woman in the middle of a courthouse hallway. They think she's powerless, that she'll stay quiet, but they couldn't be more wrong, because this woman, she's not just anyone, and in just a few minutes the very system they've abused for years begins to crumble. What follows is a clash of power, corruption, and ice-cold justice. And trust me, you won't see the ending coming. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below. We read every one. Chicago in winter had a way of looking tired. The wind snapped around corners like it had a personal vendetta, and the snow on the sidewalks had long since turned gray with soot and history. The towering courthouse on Harrison Street stood like a monument to something that had once felt pure justice, perhaps, but now mostly felt like bureaucracy wrapped in marble. It was 7:15 a.m., still dark enough for the street lamps to flicker against the falling flakes. Judge Delilah Grant stepped out of her black sedan without ceremony. 65 years old, a widow, and a woman who'd spent the last 40 years inside courtrooms. She carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Her coat was thick wool, navy blue with worn cuffs, and her gloves were the kind passed down rather than bought new. No robe yet, just a woman with gray curls tucked beneath a knit hat and sharp eyes behind square-framed glasses. No one noticed her as she walked up the courthouse steps. That suited her just fine. Inside, the building smelled of disinfectant and old paper. Security guards nodded at her, some with vague recognition, but no one stood straighter. That only happened when she wore the robe. Without it, people mistook her for a retired court clerk, maybe someone's aunt coming to post bail. She didn't mind the misjudgment. She'd spent decades being underestimated, first as a black law student at Northwestern, then as a public defender who refused to take plea deals for innocent boys just to ease a DA's caseload. She had seen the inside of too many jail cells, too many broken families, too many lives weighed and discarded like paperwork. But that morning, something felt off. It wasn't the cold or the silence, it was the hum, the tension, the kind that a person like Delilah could feel in her bones. She had long trusted her instincts more than any docket. As she turned down the long corridor that led to courtroom 3B, she saw them, two police officers, white, bulky in their winter uniforms, standing over a teenage boy no older than 15, maybe 16. The kid had brown skin, dark eyes, and a backpack so heavy it made him lean to one side. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't resisting, but he was scared, and that was enough. "You think that's funny?" barked the taller cop, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "No, sir," the boy stammered. The shorter cop, stockier and angrier, stepped forward. "Don't play games with us. Why are you even in here?" The kid fumbled for his pocket, probably to pull out some kind of ID, but the taller officer grabbed his wrist before he could move. "Don't reach." Delilah's voice cut through the air, calm but unmistakable. "Officers." They didn't turn. "Officers," she repeated, louder now. The stockier one turned first. Troy Ellison, his name etched into the brass on his chest. The other, Sergeant Jacob Voss, followed, already annoyed. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am," Voss said. Delilah took another step closer. "It does if you're harassing a minor in a public building without cause," Ellison sneered. "You got a badge, lady?" "No," she said simply. Voss stepped forward, puffed up with that righteous cop energy that made men like him dangerous. "Then stay out of it. This kid's been loitering. Looks suspicious." "In a courthouse?" Delilah asked, voice even. "He doesn't belong here. He's wearing a public defender's badge," she said, nodding toward the lanyard barely peeking out from under the boy's jacket. "So unless you think public defenders need background checks now, I'd suggest you back off." Voss's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not by someone who didn't flash credentials. Delilah knew exactly what he was thinking. Troublemaker, agitator, probably some activist with a chip on her shoulder. Ellison stepped closer. "Lady," I said, "step back." and before anyone could stop it, he raised his hand and slapped her open-palmed, fast and loud. The sound cracked like a gunshot. The hallway went dead silent. A clerk, walking from the opposite wing, stopped in her tracks. The boy flinched so hard he dropped his backpack. Even the vending machine lights seemed to flicker. Delilah didn't move. Her cheeks stung hot with the fresh imprint of his palm, but she didn't reach up to touch it, didn't speak. She simply stared at him, the calm in her eyes slowly shifting into something much heavier consequence. Ellison looked startled, but not ashamed. "You shouldn't have interfered," he said, trying to sound justified, but his voice wavered just enough. Voss's jaw clenched. "Let's go," he muttered to Ellison, but it was already too late. Delilah finally spoke, her voice low but crisp. "You just struck a federal judge." The words landed like a brick. Ellison blinked. "What?" "I said," she repeated, removing one glove and reaching into her coat. "You just assaulted a federal judge." She pulled out her judicial ID, held it up for both of them to see. No one breathed. Down the hall, a bailiff had already radioed in backup. The kid, still frozen, looked at her with wide eyes like he couldn't believe what had just happened. Delilah adjusted her scarf, smoothed her coat, and turned toward courtroom 3B. 4 minutes later, Officer Troy Ellison and Sergeant Jacob Voss would begin to realize they hadn't just made a mistake. They had lit a match, and the fire was coming. Delilah didn't rush. That was never her style. Every step she took down the marble corridor toward courtroom 3B was measured, deliberate. Behind her, the silence still lingered like a held breath. The boy was safe now. Another bailiff had stepped in and was walking him toward the public defender's office. But the officers? They stayed frozen, caught in the moment between arrogance and realization. She entered the courtroom, not through the main doors, but through the side entrance reserved for judges. The lights were already on, and a few early attorneys had taken their places. A junior prosecutor sat at the table with an open file, making notes. The court reporter was adjusting her microphone. The energy in the room was business as usual. That was about to change. Delilah hung her coat neatly behind the bench and unzipped the garment bag hanging on the wall. Her black robe emerged like a second skin, familiar, comforting, heavy in all the right ways. She shrugged it on, smoothed it across her shoulders, then adjusted the silver pin at her collar, a dove, gifted by her late husband after her first year on the bench. Her fingers hesitated there, just briefly. She stepped out. The chatter died immediately. Those who knew her stood a little taller. Those who didn't notice the shift in the air. She moved past the bench, not taking her seat yet. Instead, she walked to the center of the room, calm as a preacher at a funeral. A few eyes followed her, uncertain. Then the courtroom doors burst open. Ellison and Voss entered like men still in control until they saw her. Ellison's face went pale. Voss flinched like he'd walked into a wall. They hadn't expected her to be here. Maybe they thought she'd disappear. Maybe they hoped she'd stay quiet. They had no idea what kind of woman they'd struck. Delilah turned to face the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice steady but resonant, "before we begin the day's proceedings, there is an incident that must be addressed on record." Ellison took a step forward. "Your Honor, you will remain silent," she said, not raising her voice, but cutting through him all the same. Gasps rippled from the back row. "I entered this courthouse this morning, as I have for the past 22 years, through the main doors. I was not in my robe, and I was not yet on the bench," she continued. "Because of that, 2 officers believed they had the authority to harass a juvenile and to strike a woman they assumed had no power." The prosecutor stood slowly. "Your Honor, if I may—" "No," Delilah said firmly. "You may not," she turned to the bailiff. "Is this courtroom currently under video surveillance?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said without hesitation. "Multiple angles." "Excellent." She turned back to Ellison and Voss. "Then we have both visual and audio confirmation of the events in the corridor." Voss tried to mask his panic behind a sneer. "We didn't know who you were. And that," Delilah said slowly, is exactly the problem. The room held its breath, because what you meant was, you didn't think I mattered, that I could be silenced, intimidated, dismissed, that a black woman not wearing a robe couldn't possibly be someone you'd have to answer to. Ellison shifted uncomfortably, his mouth opening, then closing again. Voss stared straight ahead, jaw locked. Delilah finally moved to the bench and climbed the steps, one at a time. Each heel click sounded like a drum beat. She took her seat. Her gavel rested before her, untouched. She didn't need it yet. "Officer Troy Ellison," she said, her voice sharpening. "Did you strike me this morning in the public hallway of this courthouse?" He stopped. "It wasn't intentional. I thought, yes or no?" His face twisted. "Yes!" There it was. On the record. Delilah leaned back slightly. "Let the record show that Officer Ellison has admitted to assaulting a sitting federal judge on court grounds, with multiple witnesses present and surveillance footage active." The court reporter's fingers tapped furiously. "And you, Sergeant Voss," she said, without missing a beat, "what were your words?" Voss swallowed hard. "I told her to step back. And when I identified myself, you didn't," he snapped, before catching himself. Delilah tilted her head. "I asked you if a white man in a suit had challenged your authority this morning. Would you have asked for his badge or assumed he belonged?" Voss said nothing. "Exactly," she said coldly. "Because this isn't about identification. This is about assumptions, and those assumptions are dangerous." The room was stone still. Even the junior attorneys, who normally snuck glances at their phones, were frozen in place. Delilah turned to the clerk. "Please contact Internal Affairs and notify them that an immediate misconduct investigation is being initiated against both officers. They are not to leave this courtroom until IA arrives." The bailiff, a stout woman named Rosalind with 25 years of experience, moved without hesitation to stand between the officers and the exit. Delilah sat back in her chair, letting the silence linger. "I have served this city for decades," she said, her voice softer now but no less powerful. "I have buried colleagues who believed in the law more than their own safety. I have stood at this bench while others tried to chip away at my presence, my authority, my right to be here." She looked directly at Ellison. "And I am telling you now, I will not let this moment slip into the shadows." At the back of the room, someone quietly stood. It was a journalist, young, camera raised, eyes wide. Delilah didn't flinch. "You wanted a story," she said. "Not just to the room, but to the city beyond. Here it begins." And with that, she finally reached for her gavel. One sharp crack. Court was in session. The courtroom emptied slowly after the morning session, its energy still charged with everything that had just taken place. Reporters loitered by the doorways, whispering into their phones, too stunned to leave. Officers lingered in the halls, unsure where to stand. And somewhere in the corner of the courthouse's grand architecture, a whisper began to circulate, not about what had happened, but about who had finally dared to speak it out loud. Delilah remained at the bench longer than usual. She removed her robes slowly, like peeling off armor after battle, and folded it over her arm. Carter, her longtime clerk and former Marine, met her at the hallway with 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand, his mouth tight but his eyes proud. "IA just called," he said. "They're on their way." 30 minutes. "Good," Delilah said, accepting the coffee. "This can't wait." They walked together down the back corridor, bypassing the main rotunda where the press had begun to gather like crows before a storm. Delilah didn't acknowledge them. Not yet. She needed facts, not sound bites. Back in her chambers, she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a file she'd been keeping for months, perhaps years, in spirit. It was labeled simply, Ellison Voss. Notes. Inside were handwritten observations, dismissed complaints, articles that never made it past a second page. Whispers from defense attorneys, quiet rumors from court staff, even a few comments from witnesses too scared to go on record. "I didn't want to believe it," she said aloud, thumbing through the pages. "But I always knew. Carter hovered nearby. "There's more," he said grimly. "You want to see the personnel records?" She nodded. He placed a thick beige folder on her desk. Inside, internal affairs summaries. Most marked closed without action. A few had red flags, excessive force complaints, failure to follow protocol, inappropriate conduct during traffic stops. Ellison's name came up 6 times. Voss? 9. But the pattern wasn't just about the number of incidents. It was who had signed them off. Time and again, the same people appeared. ADA Susan Keller, Judge Rourke, and a former IA supervisor named Daniel Morley, now quietly retired and living in Lake Geneva. Delilah sat back, letting the information settle like snow in a shaken globe. "This isn't just about 2 bad cops," she said. "No," Carter replied. "It's about everyone who kept them safe." She nodded slowly. "Then we dig." By the time Agent Lauren Yu from Internal Affairs arrived, Delilah had a timeline mapped across 3 legal pads, a printout of case numbers highlighted in red, and a binder full of witness testimony that had never made it to court. She welcomed Yu into her office like an old friend, though they'd only spoken once before briefly, after a juvenile hearing that had turned violent outside the building. Yu, in her 40s and fiercely composed, didn't waste time on small talk. "I've seen the footage," she said, "and the incident report is being written as we speak. What you want next is bigger than IA. You understand that?" "I do," Delilah said. "You're pulling a thread that doesn't stop at Ellison." "I want it to unravel," Delilah replied. "All the way." Yu opened her laptop and turned it toward her. A digital copy of the incident played on screen. Ellison's slap, in slow motion, the echo of silence after. Delilah's measured response. "There's nothing ambiguous here," Yu said. "Good," Delilah said. "Then let's get specific." She began pointing to the case list she had built. Juvenile defendants, mostly black and Latino, stopped under suspicion, often held overnight without contact. One boy's file noted a broken wrist during a fall in custody. A 16-year-old girl was once forced to change her statement after ADA Keller threatened to charge her with obstruction. In every case, Voss or Ellison had touched the arrest file, and in every case, the complaints were either dismissed, erased, or ignored. Yu's brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages. "This is coordinated," she muttered. "It's protected," Delilah corrected. She stood and walked to the window, arms folded tight. Outside, protesters were beginning to gather. Some had signs. Others just stood quietly, holding up photos. Faces of people who had stories. People who never got their day in court. "There's a machine in this city," Delilah said quietly. "I've seen its gears for years. I just didn't want to believe how deep the rust ran." "You shut the binder. Then let's tear the engine out." Delilah turned to her. "You'll have backup? I'll call in DOJ. This goes federal the moment we can prove cross-department collusion." "Good. We'll need a net. Because this isn't going to fall apart gently." There was a pause, the kind that feels like history shifting its weight. Yu stood, then offered her hand. "Let's bring the whole damn thing down." Delilah shook it firmly. "Let's make them remember what justice looks like." Later that night, as Carter locked the office doors and Yu returned to HQ with boxes of evidence, Delilah sat alone at her desk, staring at the folder that started it all. Her fingers brushed over the word notes one more time before she slid it into a fireproof safe. Tomorrow, the headlines would talk about the slap, but she knew that wasn't the story. The story was about the system, and it was finally cracking. The next morning began with wind and headlines. By sunrise, the footage from the courthouse had already made its way to the morning news. It wasn't grainy cell phone video this time. It was crisp, courtroom-grade surveillance. The slap, the silence, and Judge Delilah, Grant's quiet thunder. News anchors tried to keep their voices neutral, but the tension bled through the screen. Chicago judge assaulted in courthouse incident. One chyron read. "Officers suspended pending investigation," said another. The word racist was being avoided, but it hung over every panel discussion like smoke. Delilah sat at her kitchen table, robe open over a gray turtleneck, staring into her coffee like it might tell her how the day would go. She hadn't slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that boy's face frightened, alone, and then felt the sting of Ellison's palm again, not because it hurt, but because of what it meant. Even now, at 65, with decades on the bench, some men still only saw the robe, not the woman. And without the robe, she was invisible again. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She let it ring. Then a knock at the door. It was Carter, early, holding 2 folders and looking like he hadn't slept either. "You need to see this," he said, without even saying hello. She let him in. He dropped the folders on her table and flipped one open. Word came down last night. Boone's union rep has already started making calls. They're trying to spin this, say, "You provoked Ellison," trying to claim you escalated. Delilah raised an eyebrow. By standing still and being struck? Carter didn't laugh. "They're pushing a narrative that you were aggressive, that you endangered officers. The usual garbage. I expected that," she said calmly. "What about internal affairs?" "They're moving faster than I thought. Agent Yu submitted the request to flag 15 past cases. She also got approval for a preliminary DOJ liaison." "Good," Delilah murmured. But Carter hesitated. "What?" He pulled out a slim, unmarked envelope and slid it across the table. She didn't touch it. "What is it?" "It was taped to the side entrance of the courthouse this morning. Janitor found it." Delilah stared at it for a long second before finally flipping it open. Inside was a printed photo of her nephew, Elijah, 14, riding his bike home from school 2 days ago. The back was blank except for 5 typed words. "Stay in your lane, Judge." She sat very still. No gasps, no shaking hands, no dramatics. Just a slow inhale through her nose and a long exhale through her mouth. "Jesus," Carter muttered. "You okay?" "I'm fine." "No, you're not." "I'm standing," she said. He didn't argue. She pulled out her phone, scrolled to her sister's contact, and hit call. When her sister answered, sleepy but cheerful, Delilah's tone changed. "I need Elijah pulled from school today, quietly. Tell the school it's a family emergency." "I'll explain later." "Del, what's going on?" "I'll explain later. Just trust me." By 8:15 a.m., Delilah was walking into the courthouse again, this time flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. She didn't argue when Carter suggested extra protection. Not today. Her chambers felt colder than usual. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of cold that clings to the walls and makes the air heavier. Agent Yu arrived 20 minutes later with more bad news. "We traced the message," she said, holding the photo. "Whoever sent it used a burner phone to make a routing request through an anonymous print lab in Missouri. Paid in cash. Covered their tracks well. Police? We're assuming Ellison or someone connected. But this doesn't feel like him. It's too careful. Voss? Possible. But there's another name that keeps coming up in the background. Lieutenant Marcus Reeve." Delilah's brow furrowed. "Reeve? He's retired. Only on paper," Yu replied. "He's still tight with half the command staff. And he worked closely with Ellison for a decade. Word is, he didn't take kindly to you putting Ellison on notice. He sent the message? We can't prove it. Yet." Delilah stood and looked out her window. The snow had stopped, but the streets below were still wet, glistening like black glass. "Let me be clear," she said without turning. "This isn't just about a slap. This is a system fighting for its survival. They've hidden behind fear for decades. Fear of retaliation. Fear of losing your job. Fear of waking up to photos of your family taped to your door." Yu stepped beside her. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," Delilah said, "and I'm still standing." By noon, she held a closed-door meeting with 2 DOJ officials and the city's federal prosecutor. She laid out the names, the connections, the timelines. She passed around copies of juvenile case files, marked no charges filed, and evidence dismissed. She showed them Keller's signature on 5 separate cases involving Ellison. The federal prosecutor, a stern black woman named Florence Ames, looked at the files like they smelled foul. "You understand what you're asking for, Judge Grant?" she said. "I do. This could trigger an ethics investigation. Judicial review. Grand jury. Good," Delilah said. "Make it loud." Later that afternoon, another envelope appeared on her desk. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "You've been warned once." Delilah didn't call anyone. She didn't alert the press. She simply placed the letter inside a folder labeled Evidence and slid it into her safe. Then she picked up her phone and called Agent Yu. "Tell the marshals I want someone at my sister's house tonight. Quiet detail. No uniforms, no questions. I'll take care of it," Yu said. "And tell your team this too. I'm not backing down. If they want to scare me into silence, they better bring more than envelopes and shadows. They better bring the whole damn department." That night, Delilah sat in her chair by the window, lights off, robe still hanging from the back of her door. She watched the snow fall again, quieter this time, softer. In the darkness, her reflection stared back at her tired, fierce, unbowed. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this much: they were afraid now, and that was a start. It was nearly midnight when Delilah picked up the phone and dialed the number she hadn't used in years. Not because it was out of date, she had memorized it decades ago, but because she'd made a decision long ago to keep her distance. The man who answered had once been her mentor, her friend, and briefly, something more. That was before the years carved different paths for them, before he had chosen comfort over confrontation. "Mason?" she said when he picked up, his voice still warm, still slow like bourbon. "Delilah." There was a pause. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," she replied, though without bitterness, "but long enough to matter." Another pause. He knew why she was calling. "You want to talk about what happened at the courthouse?" "No," she said. "I want to talk about what didn't happen after." A sigh. "You always were good with words. I'm not trying to be poetic, Mason. I'm trying to understand how a man like you, who taught me to believe in the system, can live with what he's let slide under his bench." She could hear him shift in his chair. Maybe he was in his study, still in that old townhouse with the oak-paneled office and the untouched law journals lining the walls. He used to say justice had a smell: aged books and cold coffee. "You know how this city works," he finally said. "I know how it's supposed to work," she answered. "Delilah," he said softly, like someone trying to deliver bad news gently. "There are levers in this place you can't pull without losing the whole machine." She almost laughed. "Then maybe the whole machine needs to break." There was a long silence. "You've made them nervous," he finally said. "Ellison, Voss. The ones above them too. Good. Not just nervous. Angry." "I'm not afraid of anger, Mason. I've seen worse." "I believe you," he said, "but I also believe you're playing with fire." Delilah looked out her window. Snow again. Chicago didn't sleep, it just waited for its next excuse to roar. "I'm not playing with anything," she said. "I'm cleaning house. Something you should have done years ago." "You think I didn't try?" His voice cracked slightly. "I tried, Dee. I pushed. I filed reports. I called in favors. And every time, they smiled in my face and shredded my paper after I left. Then why stay silent?" "Because I believed a judge who stayed in place could do more good than one who got disbarred." Delilah shook her head. "You stayed in place so long, Mason, the place changed and left you behind." He didn't respond. "I need a name," she said quietly. "The one who buried Ellison's first assault case. The one from 2015. I've got the redacted file. I need the signature." "Delilah, you owe me that much. Another beat." Then he spoke. "Captain Reeve." The report went to his desk, and the pressure came down from the DA's office. "Ramsey," back then. "You dig there, you'll find the rest." She closed her eyes. "Thank you, Delilah," Mason said, his voice tired now. "If you keep going, They won't stop at warning you. You know that, right? They'll come for your job, your name, maybe your family. They already started. Silence again. Then a quieter voice. I'm sorry. No, she said. Don't be sorry. Be useful. She hung up. The next morning, Delilah walked into the district records room with Carter and Agent Yu flanking her. She held a federal order in her hand signed just hours earlier by a DOJ liaison. It granted her access to sealed disciplinary records for any officer or department staff mentioned in over 5 complaints within the last 10 years. Reeves' name was on her list. The clerk behind the desk looked like he wanted to disappear. These files aren't digital, he said. They're archived in the sub-basement. Then unlock the stairs, Delilah said. By noon, she had what she needed, 2 boxes of reports, one labeled Retired MREEV, the other ADCERAMSAY. Inside were files that should have been audited years ago. One documented a use of force incident from 2015 involving a 17-year-old boy with a broken jaw. The IA report was missing its final page. Another had a written statement from a civilian witness who claimed Ellison shoved a pregnant woman during a traffic stop. That page had been stamped unsubstantiated in red ink by Reeve. Here's what they buried, Yu murmured, flipping through pages with her gloved hands. They built a career on fear and favors. Delilah didn't say anything for a moment. She just watched the paper trail grow thicker, darker. Carter finally asked, "What's the play now?" She picked up a document marked for internal review only and held it to the light. Her jaw tightened. They want me to stop, she said. So they're going to try to discredit me next. You're sure? Yu asked. I know how they operate. First threats, then whispers, then headlines. They're going to paint me as unstable, as unfit. They'll dig up anything they can. I'm betting a leak drops by Friday. Carter crossed his arms. So we get ahead of it. No, Delilah said. We go through it. And when we get to the other side, we bring the whole damn story with us. She turned to Yu. Start preparing subpoenas. I want Ramsey under oath. And I want Captain Reeve to testify, even if we have to drag him out of retirement kicking and screaming. Yu gave a tight nod. Delilah turned back to the box of files and placed her hand on top of it like she was steadying a beating heart. This isn't just about Ellison, she said. It's about every name they covered, every life they discarded, every lie they stapled into a file and called justice. Carter looked at her, eyes fierce. You ready for what happens when we open the whole lid? Delilah nodded slowly. I've been ready since the first time I saw a child convicted for the crime of being afraid. Then she picked up the box and walked out of the room, and behind her, the quiet hum of the city's secrets began to tremble. The wind howled through the alleys outside the courthouse, tugging at the edges of banners hanging from the lampposts Justice for All. They read, still fluttering like fragile promises. But inside, in the windowless lower floors of the district records office, the air was still and dense. It smelled of dust, ink, and time, of things forgotten on purpose. Delilah's fingers moved steadily through a mountain of files. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. Agent Lauren Yu worked beside her, sleeves rolled up, hands gloved. Carter stood near the door, arms crossed, a watchful presence. They'd been at it for hours, combing through documents no one had touched in years. And then, suddenly, Yu pulled one folder out slowly, her brow furrowing as she read. Here, she said, passing it over. Delilah took it carefully. It was a sealed internal complaint from 2019 filed anonymously. The handwriting was neat, desperate. The accusation, Officer Troy Ellison, had beaten a 17-year-old boy in the alley behind a convenience store during a warrantless stop. The boy suffered broken ribs and a concussion, but the body cam footage? Missing. The IA investigation? Closed due to lack of video evidence. Delilah flipped to the back of the file. The IA reviewer who signed off on the closure, Detective M. Whitaker. Her breath caught. Mason's protege, she muttered. Still in the chain of command until last year, you added. But get this, he didn't act alone. Look, you slid another folder next to it. An internal note from the DA's office confirmed that ADA Carson Ramsey had declined to press charges, citing inconclusive evidence. The boy's name was redacted, but there was a signed plea deal. He pled guilty to resisting arrest, served 6 months in juvenile detention. The bruises on his face didn't make it into the courtroom. Delilah looked up slowly. They railroaded him. You nodded. And he wasn't the only one. More folders surfaced. 3 more complaints. Same signatures. Same pattern. And always the names Ellison, Voss, Ramsey. This wasn't negligence, Delilah said quietly. This was a network. It still is, you replied. Delilah sat back, heart pounding. Boone isn't the rot. He's just the smell. She stood and walked to the whiteboard they'd wheeled in earlier, now covered in notes, lines, dates. She picked up a marker and circled 3 names. ADA Carson Ramsey, retired Captain Marcus Reeve, IA Officer M. Whitaker. Beside them, she wrote a single word, gatekeepers. These are the ones who kept the doors locked, she said. They made sure no complaints saw daylight. And they protected every violent officer under their command. You nodded, then glanced at her phone. We have a match on the second voice in that precinct locker room audio, the one who laughed with Boone 2 years ago. Ramsey? Delilah asked. Confirmed. Voice match is over 98%. He was laughing about you calling you activist trash. Said if you ever pushed too far, you'd be reassigned or erased. Carter stiffened. You want me to go public with that? No, Delilah said. Not yet. She looked at you. I want to hit them where it hurts first. I want a federal review of every case Boone ever touched. And I want Ramsey subpoenaed to testify under oath about prosecutorial misconduct. You raised a brow. You're aiming high. I'm aiming right, Delilah replied. They worked through the evening. More files, more connections. By nightfall, they had a list of over 30 cases tied to Boone, Ramsey, and Reeve, most involving young defendants of color. Nearly half of them involved missing footage, missing testimony, or strangely lenient internal reviews. Then came the final folder. This one wasn't marked by IA. It had a different seal, one from a private security contractor out of Atlanta. You frowned. I've seen this logo before. She opened the file, scanned the contents, then looked up sharply. This company has a standing contract with the mayor's office. It manages encrypted cloud storage for sensitive law enforcement data. Carter's eyes narrowed, meaning body cam footage, complaint records, evidence. Exactly, you said, including the footage that went missing in the Ellison case. Delilah's stomach turned. You're telling me city evidence is being outsourced to a private company with no accountability? You nodded. And guess who signed the contract? ADA Ramsey. Approved by Reeve. Delilah turned away, fists clenched at her sides. She walked to the far wall, pressed her palm against the cold concrete. Why would a city hand over that kind of power? You answered softly. So no one could audit it. Delilah turned back, jaw set. Then we audited ourselves. By 10 p.m., she was back in her chambers. The lights of Chicago flickered in the windows, distant and cold. She was exhausted, but focused. You had returned to HQ to begin compiling a master report. Carter sat across from her, reviewing case summaries. Delilah placed a call to the Department of Justice. This is Judge Delilah Grant, she said. I'm formally requesting emergency judicial intervention. I have evidence of coordinated prosecutorial and law enforcement misconduct across multiple agencies and city contracts. I'm submitting an affidavit and requesting federal oversight of all impacted cases. The official on the other end paused. Judge, do you understand what this triggers? I do, she replied. Trigger it anyway. After she hung up, Carter looked at her and asked, What happens now? Delilah didn't answer immediately. She walked over to the wall where the photo of her husband hung a younger Delilah beside him, both in robes, both smiling. Then she whispered, Now we see what they're willing to destroy to keep this buried. By dawn, the courthouse felt like a volcano just below eruption. The early light filtered through narrow windows, cutting across marble floors and tension-thick air. Outside, reporters clustered along the steps, waiting like birds sensing an earthquake. Word had spread. Something was coming. Delilah stood in front of the mirror in her chambers, adjusting her robe. She hadn't planned to preside today. In fact, her docket had been cleared at her request. But this wasn't about court business anymore. This was about something older, deeper, something that didn't need a gavel to carry authority. Carter entered without knocking. He held a slim stack of documents in one hand and a hard drive in the other. "They're here," he said. "Press is already filling the hallway. You is waiting in conference room C." She brought DOJ counsel with her. "Federal prosecutors are prepping." Delilah turned. "And Ramsey?" "Arrived 20 minutes ago. He brought someone from the ethics board. Some smug little guy named Parrish. Fresh press suit. Eyes like a shark." She nodded. "That tracks. They're not expecting you to go public." "They will," she said, picking up the binder that held her opening statement. 10 minutes later, she walked into the hearing room. Not the courtroom, not the bench. A plain room with wood-paneled walls and no elevated platform, no hierarchy. Just a table with microphones, a row of folding chairs, and 3 cameras facing forward. At the far end sat ADA Carson Ramsey, perfectly still. His usual calm had cracked, just slightly sweat at the collar, jaw clenched too tight. Beside him sat Elliot Parrish of the State Ethics Board, flipping through a legal pad like a student trying to cram before an exam. Agent Hughes stood nearby, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room. Delilah took her seat. Her robe hung open, her face unreadable. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. "I have reviewed the motion filed by the district attorney's office, requesting my recusal from any further involvement in the matter of Officer Troy Ellison and related cases," she began. "The argument centers on the claim that I, as a victim of an alleged assault, cannot remain impartial in any legal proceeding involving said officer or his affiliates." Parrish leaned forward. "That is correct, Judge Grant. The statute," she held up a hand. "I am aware of the statute, and I am recusing myself." Ramsey relaxed, just slightly. Parrish scribbled a note. "But not because I am compromised," Delilah continued. "I am recusing myself because I refuse to let this process be quietly manipulated behind closed doors. I will not be the excuse you use to bury this scandal." The room went still. "I am requesting that the Boone-Ellison matter be elevated to special federal review status. Furthermore, I am submitting a petition that an independent judicial monitor be appointed to investigate not only this case, but any and all cases prosecuted by ADA Carson Ramsey and his office in conjunction with officers under review by Internal Affairs." Ramsey's head snapped toward her. "Judge, no," Delilah said coldly. "You don't get to speak. Not yet." She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Exhibit A, 5 prosecutorial memos in which Mr. Ramsey declined to press charges against Officer Ellison, despite documented evidence of excessive force, conflicting officer testimony, and, in one case, a missing body cam log. She passed the stack to you, who laid them neatly on the table. Exhibit B, an internal memo from 2020 redirecting surveillance footage from a juvenile assault case to a private security firm under contract with the mayor's office, signed by Mr. Ramsey and approved by then Captain Marcus Reeve. Ramsey's lips parted, but no words came out. Delilah locked eyes with him. "You remember the boy, don't you?" she asked. 17, broken jaw. No record before that day. You signed the deal that made him plead guilty to resisting arrest when the only thing he resisted was being silenced. The room crackled with silence. Even Parrish looked unsure of his footing now. You placed a third file on the table. Wire transfers from a fund labeled Judicial Scholarship Initiative. Half the funds were rerouted to cover Officer Ellison's legal defense last year, Money earmarked for disadvantaged law students. That's fraud, and we're investigating it now. Delilah leaned in, her voice lower but heavier. I've seen the system bend before. I've seen it twist itself into knots, trying to justify bad behavior, protect bad men, and disguise rotting structures as stable institutions. But what you've done isn't just rot. It's scaffolding for corruption. You've propped it up for years, with signatures, with silence. Parrish looked shell-shocked. Judge Grant, I wasn't made aware. You didn't want to be, she said flatly. Then she turned to the cameras, facing the reporters who would carry her words into living rooms across the country. This city has protected men like Ellison for too long, and they didn't act alone. They had help from courtrooms, from prosecutors, from unions and donors and departments that closed ranks every time someone dared to raise a hand and say, "This isn't right." Her voice rose, not loud, but resolute. This isn't about a slap. This is about what it revealed. That a system can be weaponized, not just with bullets or batons, but with bureaucracy and bias, and the calculated erosion of accountability. She paused, letting the words land. Today, I step away from the bench not because I am intimidated, but because I am no longer willing to be part of a machine that rewards silence over truth. Carter, standing just outside the door, swallowed hard. The reporters in the back row typed furiously. Delilah stood, closed her folder, and looked directly at Ramsey. "You think this hearing is the end?" she said. "It's just the prelude." Then she turned and walked out, not as a judge, not as a target, but as a woman who had just ripped the curtain down. Outside, the air felt electric. The protest crowd had grown, and they erupted into cheers as she stepped onto the stone steps. Phones rose. Cameras flashed. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stood still, letting the truth settle like dust in sunlight. They had tried to bury the system's shame, and she had made them exhume it in front of the world. By nightfall, the smear campaign was in full swing. It began like a whisper, a vague blog post. No author, no citations. Just the kind of headline that sticks in people's minds whether it's true or not. Chicago judge. Accused of bias in 2009 case involving police misconduct. There was no substance, but it didn't need any. It was bait. And by morning, the sharks had smelled blood. Anonymous Twitter accounts flooded the feed with hashtags. Hashtag activist judge. Hashtag bias on the bench. Hashtag Grant gone rogue. News pundits, mostly those who didn't know her name a week ago, started running panels, asking whether Judge Delilah Grant had crossed the line. Others used carefully coded language. Angry, radical, too emotional. They showed old photographs of her from protests in the 90s, where she stood with a fist raised beside other black attorneys advocating for sentencing reform. A screenshot of her from a college rally was framed like a mugshot, with the chyron below reading, "Is this the image of judicial impartiality?" It was coordinated, slick, and nasty. And it didn't stop at her. By Tuesday afternoon, her nephew's school received an anonymous tip accusing her of radicalizing students through family influence. The school didn't act on it, but they called her, concerned. Delilah sat at her desk, the phone pressed to her ear, eyes fixed on nothing. Her voice didn't shake when she spoke. "Thank you for letting me know. Please assign someone to escort him to and from school until further notice." She hung up and turned to Carter, who stood across the room with his jaw clenched and hands in fists. "They're not even pretending anymore," he said. "They're coming for your life, your family, I know," she said quietly. "We could go to the press, expose the hit job, show the documents." "No," she cut in. "They want a reaction. They want me off balance. If I respond emotionally, they'll call it proof." She leaned back, stared at the ceiling. "This is a purge." Carter stepped closer. "What do you want to do?" She opened her drawer and pulled out a black binder. "What's that?" "Everything I've never said out loud." Inside were handwritten notes, legal memos, names judges, officers, attorneys. Conversations half caught in parking lots. whispered warnings from staffers who didn't want to lose their jobs, a list of cases she had flagged over the years that never sat right. And at the center of it all, one name repeated more than any other: Judge Benjamin Halcroft. Carter's eyes narrowed. He was your mentor. He was more than that, she said. He called me the future of the courts, gave me my first clerkship, wrote my recommendation for the circuit bench. And now, she flipped to a page marked with a red tab, and now I have records showing he signed off on 3 case dismissals tied to Boone. One of them involved a civil rights complaint that vanished before a hearing could even be scheduled. Carter let out a low whistle. You're about to burn the house down. No, she said. I'm showing the foundations already rotten. That night, Delilah received another envelope hand-delivered to her front porch. Inside was a photograph of her walking into the federal building 2 days earlier. On the back, written in bold black marker, "Back down. Or next time, it's your nephew." She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She called Agent U. We need to go federal. Now. By morning, the Department of Justice had agreed to assign federal marshals full-time. Her sister's home was placed under protective surveillance. Her nephew was quietly transferred to remote learning under alias registration. Delilah took a leave of absence from the bench, not to retreat, but to operate freely. From that point on, she was no longer a judge in robes. She was a witness, a survivor, a whistleblower with power and proof. But retaliation escalated. An anonymous complaint was filed to the State Ethics Board, accusing her of emotional instability. A second article was released, falsely claiming she had once falsified a financial disclosure. A third hinted she had been unfit during a trial in 2012 due to medication. The sources were vague, the stories shadowy, but they were effective. For a moment, the public opinion pendulum wobbled, until the leak came, not from Delilah, from someone else. The body cam footage from the 2019 Ellison incident, the one that had gone missing, surfaced on a whistleblower blog run by an independent journalist. The video was raw, unedited. It showed a terrified teenage boy bleeding in the back of a police cruiser, while Ellison laughed with another officer. The public exploded. Suddenly, everything shifted. The narrative they'd tried to spin unraveled. The same talking heads who'd accused Delilah of bias now asked, why did it take so long for this footage to come out? The hashtags flipped. Hashtag Grant was right. Hashtag release the files. Hashtag no more silence. Delilah stood in front of her office window, watching the chaos below, reporters shouting into cameras, protesters marching with signs, bearing the names of kids once swallowed by silence. Carter entered, holding his phone. We traced the leak. She turned. Who? An analyst in the private contractor's office. Young woman, 27. She found the file buried in a mislabeled archive and sent it out before anyone could stop her. She's safe? We're watching her now. Delilah nodded. She did the right thing. Just like you, he said. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at the latest headline on her phone. Justice Grant, Chicago judge calls out citywide conspiracy. And beneath it, a comment from a reader that made her throat tighten. She didn't ask for this fight. But thank God she showed up. Delilah closed her eyes, breathed deep. They had tried to smear her, to scare her, to break her. But now the machine was coughing, grinding, trying desperately to hold itself together. And Delilah? She was just getting started. The collapse didn't come with a bang. It came in silence, slow, methodical, like a building being dismantled brick by brick while the city watched. It began with the arrest of Officer Troy Ellison. Federal marshals arrived at his home before sunrise, calm and deliberate. No headlines yet. No media circus. Just the soft click of handcuffs and the low murmur of rights being read. He didn't resist. He barely spoke. By the time the news broke mid-morning, he was already behind reinforced doors, waiting for a lawyer who wouldn't come. The Department of Justice issued a statement by noon. Multiple charges including civil rights violations, excessive force, and destruction of evidence. The words hit the city like a slap. That same day, Sergeant Jacob Voss was pulled off duty and escorted out of the precinct by Internal Affairs. No handcuffs, just a stiff walk of shame through a hallway of silent faces. Some officers looked away, others stared with hollow eyes, knowing what this meant. The shield had cracked. Within hours, ADA Carson Ramsey resigned. He didn't hold a press conference, no statement, just a letter delivered through a press liaison, and a vague comment about stepping away to focus on family. But Delilah knew better. She had read the documents herself, the ones showing Ramsey had authorized illegal surveillance suppression, funneled money through shell nonprofits, and signed off on plea deals that silenced victims. He was lucky he walked away without cuffs. But the house of cards didn't stop there. 3 more assistant DAs were placed under review. 2 judges were formally suspended pending ethics investigations. And then came the biggest quake of all, a leaked memo from the mayor's office. It was short, blunt, dated 2 years earlier. Captain Reeve to ensure oversight of potential PR threats. Ellison plus Voss, flagged for complaints, contain fallout. Avoid scandal. Reeve's name was printed in black ink at the bottom, along with the signature of a deputy mayor who had since moved to private consulting in D.C. Delilah sat in her living room when the story hit. She didn't flinch. She didn't celebrate. She just sipped her tea and stared at the TV as anchors breathlessly tried to explain what the city had known in its bones for years, but never dared say aloud. The system had been protecting itself, and now it was crumbling. Carter arrived an hour later, breathless, holding a USB stick. "You need to see this," he said, pulling his laptop from his bag. He loaded the video file and turned the screen toward her. It was security footage recent. Inside the DA's office, a private meeting caught on a hidden camera. The audio was grainy but clear enough to hear Reeve say, "We should have shut her down the minute she opened her mouth. Now it's too late. The whole thing's coming down." Delilah watched without blinking. When the video ended, she looked up at Carter. "Let them talk," she said. "The more they confess to each other, the less we have to prove." She spent the next 2 days helping federal prosecutors prepare their timeline. Her chambers were no longer a sanctuary of legal tradition. They were a war room, maps, charts, documents taped across every surface. You came and went, like a soldier on rotation. Carter barely slept, and Delilah, for all her calm, felt the storm still in her bones. And then came the moment she didn't expect. The city offered her a deal, a quiet one. The mayor's chief of staff reached out through an intermediary, an old colleague, who had once clerked beside her. The message was clear: step down publicly, with grace, say nothing more. In exchange, they'd preserve her pension, drop the emotional fitness investigation, and let the story die quietly. She read the offer twice. Then she laughed. It wasn't a joyful sound. It was bitter, dry. The kind of laugh that comes after decades of watching men in suits hand each other keys to escape routes they never offered you. Carter asked, "You want to make a statement?" "No," she said, rising from her chair. "I want to make history." That Sunday, she walked into the federal courthouse not to preside, but to testify. The courtroom was packed. Press lined the walls. Every seat filled. Protesters outside held signs not of anger, but of gratitude. "Thank you, Judge Grant. Truth has a name. We believe her." She took the stand and spoke for nearly an hour. She told them everything. About the files she'd found, about the boy with the broken ribs, about the body cam footage, the threats, the backdoor contracts, the names, the nights she'd lost sleep, wondering how many children's lives had been quietly erased with the stroke of a pen. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She told the truth like it was gospel quiet, unwavering, undeniable. And when it was over, the prosecutor asked her one final question. "Judge Grant, why did you choose to come forward now?" She looked across the courtroom, locking eyes with the youngest intern sitting in the back row. "Because I've spent 40 years believing that the law could heal what it had broken," she said. But belief isn't enough anymore. Now, it's time to rebuild. The silence afterward wasn't silence. It was reverence. The next day, the mayor called a press conference to announce a full audit of the Police Oversight Board and promised sweeping reforms. Delilah didn't attend. Instead, she walked the halls of the courthouse one last time without her robe, without fanfare. She stopped by her favorite clerk's desk and left behind a folded note. Then she slipped out the side entrance where no cameras waited, stepped into a waiting car, and drove home. She wasn't done, but the part of her story told in marble and microphones had ended. What came next? Truth, repair, legacy would take more than headlines. It would take time, and she was finally ready to give it. The snow had stopped falling by the time Delilah stepped outside. The streets were wet, glistening with melt, and the air held that brief, crisp stillness Chicago sometimes allowed between storms. For the first time in weeks, there were no cameras waiting on her front steps, no marshals posted on the curb, no phones vibrating with headlines or legal updates, just silence, and the soft sound of her shoes on the damp pavement. She walked to the park across from her building alone, the same park where, years ago, she and her husband had taken Sunday strolls before brunch, where she used to bring her nephew to feed ducks and explain why trees lost their leaves. The benches were still the same, the old wrought iron ones, paint chipped but sturdy. She sat on the second bench from the entrance, the one with the crooked armrest, and pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. A list, written in her own hand, names of the children whose lives she'd fought to pull from the fire. Some she had helped, some she hadn't. All of them part of the truth. She didn't cry. She just sat with them a while, letting the wind carry their names forward like prayers. It had been 3 weeks since her testimony. The ripple effects hadn't stopped. The Department of Justice announced a full federal audit of Chicago's police misconduct archives dating back 15 years. 3 new indictments had been handed down, one to a former city councilman, another to a data analyst who had helped cover up internal reports, and one to the private contractor who had tampered with evidence. The mayor, under pressure from constituents and watchdog groups, created a new civilian review board with full investigative powers and subpoena authority, something reformers had begged for over a decade. The state's Legal Ethics Committee launched its own inquiry into judicial favoritism and sealed case handling. And Delilah? She declined every interview. She didn't go on television, didn't write a memoir, didn't accept the offers to consult or speak or lead reform panels. She did what she had always done. She showed up. 2 days a week, she volunteered at the Legal Aid Clinic in Bronzeville, reviewing expungement applications for youth with nonviolent records that, more often than not, had been written by the very men she helped expose. She showed up at her nephew's debate meets, cheering like it was the Supreme Court finals. She showed up at her sister's house every Friday night, bringing pie and refusing to talk about anything but old Motown records and Sunday church gossip. And when a local elementary school invited her to speak for Women's History Month, she showed up there too, no robe, just herself. The children asked strange and brilliant questions. Is being a judge boring? Do you wear a crown? Did you ever send someone to jail by mistake? And Delilah answered every one of them with honesty and care. Later that day, one little girl with thick glasses and an oversized backpack tugged at her sleeve and whispered, "I want to be a judge too." Delilah bent down, looked her in the eyes, and said, "Then promise me something. When you get there, leave the door open behind you." The girl nodded solemnly. That was the thing about legacy. It wasn't about headlines or murals or what people remembered when you were gone. It was about who you held the door open for while you were still standing. And the mural, well, that came later. She hadn't known about it until Carter showed up at her apartment with a coffee and a sly smile. "You busy?" he asked. "Not if you're buying." He led her 3 blocks down and around the corner. It had gone up overnight, painted by local artists, funded by a community grant. It was taller than she expected, 15 feet at least, A full wall. The image showed her standing in her robe, firm and composed, one hand holding a gavel at her side, the other raised not in anger, but in stillness. The courthouse stood behind her, cracked but standing. And surrounding her were faces, not specific portraits, but silhouettes, students, mothers, workers, protesters, every race, every age, all looking forward. At the base of the mural were the words, "She didn't demand power. She demanded accountability." Delilah stared at it for a long time. "They got my jawline wrong," she said eventually. Carter laughed. She didn't ask who approved it. She didn't want credit. But that night, she walked past it again alone and touched the wall where her hand was painted. It was still drying. The city had changed. Not completely, not enough, but enough to breathe differently. The precinct where Ellison once worked was under full administrative review. Internal Affairs had a new director. Officers were now required to wear body cameras that could not be manually disabled. And more importantly, for the first time, several wrongful convictions were being re-examined with an eye toward overturning. Delilah had lived long enough to know that real justice didn't move in straight lines. It looped, it faltered, it got hijacked and twisted, and sometimes buried beneath red tape. But sometimes, just sometimes, it broke through. 1 week later, she received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a flash drive and a letter, typed, unsigned. "I was one of them," it read. "One of the kids they locked up and forgot. You don't know my name, but I saw you. I saw what you did. And now I'm free. You brought me back. Thank you." Delilah sat with the letter in her lap for a long time, her hands still, her heart full. Then she plugged in the flash drive. It was a video. A young man, early 20s, standing in front of a community college. He was nervous, shaky, but smiling. "I'm starting school next month," he said into the camera. "I'm going to study law." He looked down, swallowed hard, then back up. "I figured. I'd try to finish what you started." The screen went black. Delilah closed her laptop and looked out the window. The city was loud that day, sirens, buses, laughter from somewhere down the block. Life moved on, as it always did, but somewhere, in the space between her ribcage and her spine, something had settled. Not peace. Not yet. But presence. A sense that she had been here, that she had done what she could, that she had answered when history knocked. Later that evening, she walked the halls of the courthouse one last time, not out of nostalgia, just to feel the place breathe. The walls, the wood, the worn steps that had carried generations of voices. She stopped outside courtroom 3B, empty now, still. She touched the doorframe and whispered, "Stay honest." Then she turned and walked out into the night. No escort, no spotlight. Just the sound of her heels tapping down the stone steps. A judge no longer on the bench, but still always in pursuit of what was right. Judge Delilah Grant's story is more than an expose of a corrupt system. It's a powerful reminder that courage doesn't expire with age. At 65, she didn't choose comfort or silence. She chose truth, even when it came at great personal cost. Her journey speaks to all of us, especially those who've lived long enough to know that change is never easy, but always worth it. You are never too old to make a difference. Age doesn't diminish the value of your voice, it deepens it. Whether you're standing up for justice or simply helping someone be seen and heard, your actions matter. Real change isn't always made by loud protests or powerful titles. It's made by people who choose to act when they could have just walked away. Be that person. Stand up one more time. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep telling powerful stories that deserve to be heard. Thank you.